Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré has announced a bold move, canceling the gold mining permits of foreign companies operating in the country. In a powerful statement, President Traoré said, "We know how to mine our own gold." This decision could be a game-changer as Burkina Faso seeks to take control of its valuable resources and gain independence from foreign companies. Burkina Faso
Ibrahim Traoré has spearheaded a bold transformation, breaking away from the entrenched foreign influence and steering the country towards self-reliance. His administration has challenged traditional power dynamics, driven economic reforms, and ignited renewed sense of sovereignty. But on April 3rd this year, while delivering a testimony on the US-Africa Command posture,
Continues to be a challenge in South Africa. Over 500 suspected illegal miners were arrested on Friday at the Sheba gold mine in Barberton. 24 miners, other illegal miners, were also arrested yesterday morning. Now, illegal mining has become a growing concern, particularly areas where abandoned mines provided opportunities for unauthorized mining activity. Can we put an end to illicit mining?
Of billions of dollars in gold is illegally smuggled out of the continent each year.
What we have found is that more than 435 tons of gold was smuggled out of Africa in 2022. And at the current price of gold today, this corresponds to a value of more than 36 billion US dollar.
Ghana, one of Africa's top gold producers, has seen the impact of that illegal mining.
Among the biggest complaints from communities here in Ghana about illegal mining.
Mali has seized 3 tons of gold from Canadian mining company Barrick Gold, which has operated in the West African country for decades. Mali previously said Barrick Gold owed the government over $500 million in unpaid taxes, but a recent statement by Mali's economy ministry placed the figure at $5.5 billion. Barrick Gold CEO Mark Bristow wrote to staff members on Sunday, January 12th.
Burkina Faso is expelling foreign gold miners for local producers. Also outside Africa now, Revolt calls out Meta for
making an all-new effort to target and curb illegal mining in the country. The government has decided to deport all foreign nationals who are engaged in illegal mining activities. This unethical activity is also known as galanzi. Now, the big announcement was made by the Foreign Affairs Minister Samuel Okuzeto Ablakwa while he was addressing President John Mahama-led regime as making an all-new effort to target and curb illegal mining in the country. The government has decided to deport all foreign nationals who are engaged in illegal mining activities. This unethical activity is also known as galanzi. Now, the big announcement was made by the Foreign Affairs Minister Samuel Okuzeto Ablakwa while
tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. All of these minerals are found in our electronics and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which contains an estimated $24 trillion in untapped mineral resources. Yet the DRC remains one of the poorest and most dangerous countries in the world, and mining these 4 metals can help fund armed conflict in the region.
The mining potential of this country is just beyond imaginable, and yet you have
Africa's sudden decision to expel several Western mining companies sent a shockwave through global markets, but nowhere was the panic louder than in the United States. For decades, Washington believed it had an unshakable hold on Africa's mineral sector, relying on the continent for cobalt, lithium, manganese, rare earths, and a dozen other strategic resources that kept its defense industry, tech manufacturing, and energy transition alive. But overnight, that illusion shattered. In a coordinated announcement, African governments declared that all Western-operated mines would be suspended, reviewed, and in some cases, permanently terminated. The continent accused these companies of undervaluing resources, violating environmental agreements, exploiting local labor, and failing to transition Africa from raw material exporter to industrial partner. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The United States reacted instantly. Commodity prices spiked, manufacturers scrambled, electric vehicle companies halted expansion plans, and defense contractors warned of severe shortages. A single statement from an African economic bloc erased billions from American markets within hours. Analysts described the moment as a breaking point. The West never believed Africa had the power to pull, but Africa had been preparing for years. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was the culmination of a long, quiet shift in global alliances, economic planning, and strategic frustration with the West's model of extraction without transformation. African leaders made it clear that the era of selling raw minerals at bargain prices was over. Instead of exporting unprocessed cobalt or nickel, African governments began demanding in-country processing plants, battery factories, mineral refineries, and industrial partnerships that generated long-term value. The West resisted these demands, insisting the global supply chain was too complex to relocate. Africa responded with a single unified action, shutting the door. Mines in Central Africa, Southern Africa, and parts of East Africa were suddenly sealed, with military support deployed to protect strategic zones. This level of coordination across multiple African countries stunned Washington. For decades, Western analysts believed African states were too divided to act collectively. They were wrong. Now the United States faced a crisis it never prepared for. Its renewable energy sector depended heavily on African minerals, especially cobalt and rare earths. Its semiconductor supply chain relied on key metals sourced from African soil. Even its aerospace and defense sectors felt the shock, as several rare minerals essential for aircraft, satellites, and missile systems were no longer guaranteed. The United States had spent years warning about dependence on Asia, especially China, but it never imagined Africa would become its greatest strategic vulnerability. And yet, that was exactly what had happened. Markets reacted violently. Lithium prices skyrocketed. Cobalt futures were suspended due to extreme volatility. Energy companies warned that EV adoption would slow dramatically. Meanwhile, African countries stood firm, refusing to reverse the ban despite political pressure from Washington. Their message was simple: no more extraction without partnership. They demanded that any country wishing to access Africa's minerals must invest in Africa's industrialization. For decades, the United States had preached about shared prosperity, but African governments argued that the reality had been one-sided profit. Western companies grew rich, while African economies remained dependent and unindustrialized. What made Washington even more nervous was that Africa was not acting alone. Within days of the announcement, delegations from China, Russia, India, Brazil, and several Middle Eastern nations arrived in key African capitals. They came offering alternative deals that included infrastructure investment, technology transfer, refineries, smelters, and battery plants. They did not demand exclusive control. They did not dictate political conditions. They offered what African leaders had been requesting from the West for decades: respect, value, and industrial partnership. Suddenly, Washington faced the terrifying possibility that it might be permanently locked out of Africa's mineral future. Africa's reserves were not just significant. They were essential. The continent held the largest cobalt deposits on Earth, massive reserves of key rare earth elements, world-class copper belts, and one of the fastest-growing lithium sectors. Without Africa's supply, the United States risked falling behind in electric vehicles, artificial intelligence hardware, green energy grids, and advanced defense technology. The global competition for minerals had always been fierce, but Africa's collective stance transformed it from competition into crisis. In Washington, emergency meetings were held as officials debated how to respond. Some called for diplomatic pressure. Others warned that the United States had no leverage left. The usual promises of aid and development no longer impressed African governments. The usual threats of sanctions were meaningless because Africa had new partners ready to step in and fill the economic gap, and the usual argument that Western companies offered better values rang hollow after decades of environmental damage, expired promises, and exploitative contracts. Meanwhile, African nations showcased their new confidence. They highlighted long-term plans to build battery factories across southern Africa, refining centers in eastern Africa, mineral trading hubs in western Africa, and large-scale smelting facilities in Central Africa. They explained that controlling the processing stage would multiply their profits by 10 and enable Africa to insert itself into global value chains instead of remaining trapped at the bottom. It was a strategic masterstroke that transformed Africa from a supplier into a global industrial player. The United States finally began to realize what was happening. Africa was not isolating itself, it was repositioning itself. And the West had underestimated the continent's strategic patience, unity, and economic ambition. As more countries joined the mineral ban against Western corporations, U.S. political leaders issued increasingly frantic statements urging negotiation. But Africa stood unmoved. They insisted that not a single mine would reopen under old models. Either the West adapted to the new rules or it lost access entirely. By the end of the Weak, it became clear that Africa had rewritten the global mining map. Washington was left scrambling to secure alternative suppliers, but none could replace Africa's scale, quality, and long-term potential. Panic spread through American industries as they realized the truth. For the first time in modern history, Africa, not Washington, not Brussels, not Tokyo, was controlling the terms of global mineral trade, and this was only the beginning.
The shockwaves from Africa's decision to expel Western mining companies did not end at the mine gates. What followed in the days after the announcement was a continental restructuring of power, strategy, and economic ambition that caught not only Washington off guard but also every Western capital still dependent on Africa's critical minerals. In the heart of southern Africa, the first major policy shift unfolded. Several governments gathered in a closed-door emergency meeting, guarded by military personnel and buzzing with diplomats who suddenly realized the old playbook had expired. African nations, long treated merely as suppliers of raw materials, had moved beyond the era of passive agreements and symbolic partnerships. Their message, too. The world was clear: control over mineral wealth would no longer be outsourced, undervalued, or dictated by foreign interests. What unsettled Washington most was the speed and coordination behind Africa's decision. It wasn't a single country acting alone. It was a bloc united by a shared frustration that had been building for decades. From cobalt fields to lithium basins, from uranium plains to massive gold belts, African countries had compared notes, assessed losses, measured environmental damage, and realized that the profits that once flowed outward could instead fuel their own rise. And so, overnight, the mining concessions held by Western giants were suspended. Some were placed under review, some were revoked entirely, others were reclaimed outright and handed over to newly formed state-backed corporations. What stunned U.S. officials was not simply the loss of access, but the structure of the replacement strategy. Africa wasn't kicking out Western miners to nationalize resources and lock the world out. No, it was opening the door to new partners under entirely different conditions. Countries from Asia, the Middle East, and South America were already arriving with proposals that placed Africa, not themselves, at the center. These agreements emphasized shared refining, joint intellectual property, technology transfer, workforce development, locally built processing plants, and above all, ownership of the value chain. For the first time, Africa was positioning itself not just as a supplier but as a manufacturer, an innovator, and a broker of critical mineral diplomacy. This was precisely the nightmare scenario U.S. analysts had warned about for years. In Washington, a flurry of emergency briefings filled conference rooms across various agencies. Analysts pointed to a single root cause: the United States had underestimated Africa's political evolution. They assumed that as long as Western companies provided jobs and infrastructure promises, access to resources would be guaranteed. But they failed to see how Africa's young population, rising literacy rates, new leadership class, and expanding global alliances had reshaped national priorities. The expulsion erupted because Africa was tired of being a pawn in the global economy. Countries realized they held something Washington desperately needed for its energy transition, and that desperation had value. Cobalt for electric vehicles, lithium for batteries, manganese for steel and electronics, platinum for hydrogen technologies, uranium for nuclear energy, rare earths for defense systems. The world depended on Africa far more than Africa depended on anyone else, and that realization had changed everything. In Central Africa, where some of the world's richest cobalt reserves are found, government officials began publicly detailing just how lopsided previous contracts with Western miners had been. Environmental damage had been glossed over, community displacement had been ignored, billions in potential revenue had vanished through loopholes, and underpriced exports. Now, using a new digital auditing system supported by non-Western partners, Africa was tracking every ounce of exported minerals in real time, making old extraction tricks impossible. Meanwhile, in West Africa, new mineral legislation was drafted with unprecedented boldness. It capped foreign ownership, mandated local processing, and required that a percentage of all mineral-based profits be directed into national sovereign wealth funds. This meant minerals would not only create jobs, they would build generational capital. In East Africa, refining plants funded through new global alliances were rising at a pace that astonished outside observers. African engineers trained abroad were returning home in large numbers, attracted by incentives and the chance to be part of a continental industrial revolution. The narrative had shifted. Africa was no longer a raw material exporter, it was becoming a minerals powerhouse. And with this transformation, the geopolitical landscape began to tilt. Europe, already strained by an energy crisis and accelerating industrial slowdown, watched nervously as Africa redirected mineral access to countries that offered better terms. The European Union held emergency meetings, trying to propose new equal partnership deals after decades of unequal ones. But the trust deficit was too large and the timing was too late. In Washington, the panic took a different form, the realization that the United States had no immediate backup plan. American automakers, defense manufacturers, semiconductor companies, and renewable energy firms relied heavily on Africa's mineral supply chains. Without them, production schedules would collapse and costs would skyrocket. Even more alarming was the intelligence briefing that confirmed Africa's new partners, especially those from Asia and Eurasia, had secured first rights to future mineral output. These agreements were carefully designed to protect Africa's sovereignty, making it impossible for Western countries to pressure or intimidate individual governments. All of this stirred a sense of geopolitical urgency within the U.S. administration. Lobbyists sent desperate messages warning that critical industries were on the verge of being outcompeted. Energy analysts described the situation as a supply chain black swan. Academic circles referred to it as a mineral realignment of the century. But Africa remained unmoved, from North Africa's rising industrial zones to southern Africa's deep mining belts. Officials continued to assert that this was not an act of hostility. It was an act of evolution. Africa did not want conflict, it wanted fairness. It wanted the right to shape its own future, and the more Africa asserted its agency, the more global attention it attracted. Latin American nations, observing Africa's boldness, began considering similar reforms. Southeast Asian countries expressed interest in joining a new mineral coordination platform Africa was designing. Middle Eastern nations, long seeking strategic diversification beyond oil, offered to partner with Africa on large-scale refining and renewable energy initiatives. The result was a new global alliance map forming in real time, one where Africa was not the passive participant but the gravitational center. For the United States, the fear was not merely losing mineral access, it was losing influence, losing leverage, losing the assumption that global supply chains would always bend in its favor. The world was changing, and Africa was defining that change. And as the reshuffling accelerated, one unsettling question began circulating through Washington think tanks, newsrooms, and diplomatic circles. If this is what Africa can do in a single coordinated move, what will the next decision be? Across Africa, the decision to expel Western miners ignited not chaos but momentum and economic awakening that revealed the continent's readiness to rewrite global norms. What had begun as a defensive response to decades of underestimation became a bold blueprint for a new world order, as mining fields transitioned into locally controlled zones and new alliances formed. Africa's confidence surged, and external powers realized this shift was irreversible. In southern Africa, the new state-backed mineral consortiums rolled out their first coordinated strategy, a continent-wide mineral pricing framework. It was a revolutionary move, something Western economists had long argued Africa lacked the unity to achieve. But in a stunning show of coordination, nations with cobalt, lithium, graphite, manganese, uranium, and rare earth deposits agreed to adopt a unified pricing mechanism. Instead of competing against each other, they aligned. Instead of letting foreign corporations dictate prices, they asserted control. This decision alone sent shockwaves into global markets. Mineral prices spiked, commodity exchanges trembled, executives in major Western capitals scrambled to assess how much leverage Africa now held. And as the news spread, African citizens, long accustomed to seeing wealth extracted while poverty persisted, felt a renewed sense of pride. For the first time in generations, the continent was not reacting to global forces, it was shaping them. In Central Africa, the transformation was physical as much as political. Mining regions once dominated by foreign trucks, foreign supervisors, and foreign logistics now buzzed with local engineers and newly trained technicians. Large infrastructure projects, railways, refineries, industrial parks were fast-tracked through new partnerships with non-Western nations. These agreements came with an unprecedented requirement. African nations would retain majority ownership, and all technology shared must be co-developed, not gifted and controlled. This shifting landscape frustrated Western governments who accused Africa of closing the market, but African leaders countered with a firm stance. The market was not being closed, it was being rebalanced. Africa was simply taking back what had always been its own. In West Africa, the political rhetoric sharpened as news anchors and ministers challenged narratives coming from Europe and Washington. They exposed old mining contracts that gave Western corporations tax holidays of up to 20 years, leaving nations with as little as 3% of export revenue. citizens reacted with anger, not toward the present reforms, but toward the historical exploitation they had been unaware of. Town hall broadcasts and public forums exploded with discussions about national sovereignty, fair trade, and the future of African industrialization. Citizens demanded that no contract be signed unless it guaranteed domestic job creation and environmental protection. The mood had shifted. Africa was no longer the continent begging for investment, it was the continent choosing its partners. Meanwhile, in East Africa, a new global financial corridor began forming. With substantial support from Asia and the Middle East, African nations created a minerals exchange center headquartered on the continent. This exchange allowed African states to sell minerals directly, bypassing brokers and intermediaries who had long siphoned away value. Western investment banks, previously the dominant brokers of global commodity trades, found themselves frozen out. As the minerals exchange center gained traction, Western analysts attempted to label it a risky experiment. But their warnings fell flat. The exchange attracted early interest from South America, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe regions that saw in Africa an opportunity to escape dollar-dependent supply chains. And that was the point that truly set Washington into panic mode. For decades, the strength of the US dollar had been reinforced by America's dominance in global commodity flows. But now Africa's new exchange offered the option to settle mineral trades in multiple currencies. The shift was subtle, quiet, but enormous. It threatened to weaken a foundational pillar of U.S. global power. Inside Washington, senior officials were forced into late-night strategy sessions. Policy analysts described Africa's expulsion of Western miners not as an isolated act but as the spark of a global economic realignment. Defense officials warned that without secure access to African minerals, even the U.S. military's technological edge, including satellites, surveillance systems, and advanced communications, could be compromised. But Africa was not watching Washington's panic. It was focused inward, building momentum across the continent. Universities expanded engineering programs. Technical institutes launched new curricula in geology, metallurgy, battery science, and industrial engineering. African students who once dreamt of migrating abroad began applying for local scholarship programs designed to prepare them for leadership roles in the mineral sector. For the first time, Africa was sculpting the workforce needed for its new industrial identity. And as the talent pipeline grew, so did Africa's global influence. In diplomatic corridors from Asia to South America, African delegations were treated with a new level of respect. Countries that had once seen Africa solely as a supplier now saw it as a strategic equal, one that could alter global technological timelines. The tone of international negotiations changed. African demands were no longer dismissed as unrealistic, they were acknowledged as essential. Europe, still reeling from energy and manufacturing crises, attempted to renegotiate access to African minerals under more respectful conditions. But African nations insisted on terms Europe had never agreed to before: long-term price guarantees, transparent auditing, shared refining technology, and environmental accountability. Europe hesitated, Africa did not, and so Europe found itself competing with other global powers who came not with paternalistic offers but with cooperative ones. These new players agreed to build processing plants on African soil, train African engineers, and co-own intellectual property. In exchange, they received reliable, long-term mineral access under Africa's new rules. This was the geopolitical shift Washington feared most. Africa was no longer tethered to Western economies. It had become a free agent in global affairs. Yet, despite its rising power, Africa did not seek revenge or isolation. Instead, it championed a philosophy grounded in partnership, not dependency; sustainability, not extraction; innovation, not exploitation. The final blow to Western confidence came when Africa announced that it was forming a Continental Minerals Oversight Council. This council would regulate extraction standards, price coordination, environmental protections, and cross-border mineral logistics. It functions similarly to OPEC but on a far larger scale, covering the minerals that would shape the future of global technology, energy, and defense. Western pundits immediately labeled it a threat to global stability, but global markets understood the truth. Africa was becoming the most influential mineral bloc in the world. Amid all of this, African nations remained focused. Their goal was not to make the U.S. panic, it was to rise. But the more Africa rose, the more Washington realized its position was slipping. In think tank discussions, an unsettling question began circulating. If Africa could assert this much power with minerals alone, what else could the continent control in the future: manufacturing, energy grids, global shipping lanes, digital infrastructure? The world had shifted. the balance had changed, and Africa, long underestimated, was now a central architect of the new geopolitical order.